Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Qatar Banking Perspectives webinar. My name is Mena Bukar. I'm Head of Marketing for KPMG in Qatar. While we are waiting for a few more participants to join, I would like to introduce you to some housekeeping rules. First of all the attendees will be on mute during the whole webinar session. However, you may submit questions at any point of time in the right-hand side during the webinar. We'll make sure to answer as many as we can during our Q&A session. We'll also be sharing some poll questions with you. They will appear on the right-hand side as we proceed through the presentation. Please make a response. At the end of the webinar, you'll be directed to the feedback form. We would really appreciate if you take a minute to fill in and if you provide your feedback. Thank you very much. With that, I'll hand over to our today's host, Omar Mahmoud. Omar.
Thank you, Marina, for that kind introduction, and good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for the launch of our Qatar Banking Perspectives Report 2020. This is the second in a series of our publication, with last year being the first year that we introduced this report. This year's report is titled Disruption and Opportunities, and really does focus on both some of the challenges that are emerging as a result of the current crisis and also some of the opportunities that are arising from the current pandemic in the banking sector. The report showcases insights and thoughts from our FS leadership team based in Qatar and really covers four broad themes. It covers the market and business, where we discuss strategic implications of COVID-19 and some of the more topical issues as a result of the current pandemic. It covers articles around technology and innovation, and as you can expect, this is a very, very topical area at the moment. And under technology and innovation, we'll look at digital innovation, and we will also look at some of the risks that are emerging out of the current change in banking practices. We'll also then focus on risk and regulatory matters, where we talk about some of the emerging tax regulations and also look at the transition away from LIBOR that's expected to take place on 1 Jan 2022. And finally, governance and controls, where we discuss and talk about topics such as ESG and the impact of governance on the banking sector, particularly as we've changed many of the working practices over the last few weeks. This session today comes at a time where we have unprecedented global change within financial markets and also as a whole, and also particularly in Qatar, where we had the announcement last week of talks between two local banks of a potential merger, means that these are incredibly exciting times for the banking sector at large. What I'd like to do is maybe just start off by setting some context by going through some numbers and just set the tone in terms of how the banking sector in Qatar is actually doing based on the results that were reported for the first quarter. The results that were reported for the first quarter were issued early on in April, and in fact banks in Qatar were one of the first banks, some of the first banks in the region and across the globe to actually publish their results for the first quarter. So the effects of the pandemic have not necessarily been seen at their fullest, some would say, given that the results were reported early to mid-April. So really, as we go through the year in second quarter, third quarter, and then obviously at the year end, we expect to see the effects of the pandemic on the banking sector really reveal their true colors. But as far as the first quarter results are concerned, really it's a positive story. We've seen total assets growing at 1.8% when we compare that to December, somewhat muted growth compared to previous year ends and quarter ends that we've seen, but certainly a positive sign given the current market conditions. The net profit attributable to equity holders of banks on average for the listed banks in Qatar, broadly flat, down slightly at 0.1%, and not necessarily at the double-digit or high single-digit growth rates that we've seen in the past, but still we're not seeing a significant drop or decline in profitability quarter on quarter as compared to 2019. The cost-to-income ratio of banks in Qatar continues to be at very low levels. March 2020 operating at around 25%, which is certainly the lowest in the GCC region, and probably one of the lowest across the globe. And this is a real focus area for banks in Qatar. We ran a poll on a similar webinar that we ran a few weeks ago, and we asked bankers the question around their immediate priorities. Would that be digital investment? Would that be cost control? Or would that be revenue enhancement? And the majority responses were that cost control continued to be the priority for the near future. So we do expect this 25% number to go down further. Capital adequacy ratio of banks continues to be strong in Qatar, averaging around 18%. And this is something that we continue to see a focus area for banks. This is well above the minimum regulatory requirements for banks in Qatar. And we do see banks in Qatar as being well capitalized and in a strong position to weather the current storm. From a share price and market perspective, we've seen a decline in share price since December. Clearly, we've seen sentiment as well as fundamentals play a role. And while fundamentals have still been strong, market sentiment has obviously been affected by the current situation that we're faced with COVID-19. So we've seen an average 15.6% drop in share prices from December the 31st to 31st of March. But since then, we've seen a recovery. And we look at the position from December up until where we stand today, early July, there's been a drop of around 9%. So certainly an improvement from the 31st of March. And the final stat that I just wanted to share with you, probably one of the most important, is the provision charge on loans and advances. This is something that obviously gets a huge amount of scrutiny and is a focus area. As analysts and the like, we look to see how COVID-19 has affected the credit quality of banks. And here we have seen a 34.9% increase in provisioning, and this is comparing the quarter ended 31st March 2020 versus 31st March 2019. And this is something that will continue, and I'm sure the analysts in the industry will continue to monitor. Certainly not at the levels that we saw some of the regional counterparts. We have seen in Saudi and the UAE the increase in provisions anywhere between 80% and 250% on average. So we do expect this number potentially to increase through the year as the true effect of the pandemic really affects the sector. But certainly some of the measures that the banks in Qatar have taken in previous years, particularly from 2017, where underwriting has been tightened and some of the credit monitoring practices have been further enhanced, we do feel that banks in Qatar are in a strong position to not have a significant deterioration in credit quality going forward. So really with that, in terms of today's session, what we'll be having is a panel session for 40 minutes or so, where I will be speaking to our panelists today. And then we will also have an opportunity for 15 or 20 minutes to take questions that you will be posing through the chat box. With us today, we have Venkat, who leads our advisory practice in Qatar. We have Barbara, who heads up our tax offering. We have Ali, who's in charge of our risk advisory practice. And we have Saeed, who leads our financial services consulting division. So I could invite all panelists to come on camera today. And before I do dive into the first panel question and introduce our panelists to come and answer some of the questions, what I'd like to do is maybe start off with a poll question, if I may. Really looking to see how the current crisis compares versus 2008, and that's something that's been discussed a lot. So our first poll question is on screen. We have 45 seconds or so to answer the question, and the question is, how does the current pandemic compare to the 2008 financial crisis? Is it A, the same? Is it B, more severe? Or is it C, less severe? And this is, while we're answering the question, this is something that's been debated and discussed a lot at numerous forums, and there's mixed views on this. And while 2008 clearly was a financial crisis at the core, with credit, liquidity, and capital implications, we have seen 2020 as primarily being a health crisis that's resulted in financial implications. So it'd be interesting to see what the general view is from the attendees today. And as we can see here, there's a clear majority that says more severe. And I think this is consistent with what we have heard industry leaders and industry specialists say with regards to 2020, because we're not necessarily just dealing with a financial crisis, we're dealing with much wider and larger economic and social implications with what we're faced with today. So on that note, if I could go to our first question and call upon Saeed. Saeed, you've authored an article in the publication that really talks about COVID-19 and how that's affected the banking sector. So it'd be good to get your thoughts around what you see as the key strategic implications of COVID-19 on the banking sector in Qatar, and really what you see banks focusing on as a result of the situation that we're faced with today. So Saeed, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Umar. Hi, everyone. Umar, I personally think that this pandemic has been an opportunity for the banks, not just in Qatar, across the world, to sort of reset themselves, take a step back from the day-to-day operations, and relook at their long-term strategic objectives. I mean, it's okay for a bank to, put on a few extra layers of fat in terms of excess cost, redundant processes and systems when things are normal. But a situation like this gives them a perfect opportunity to sort of trim off that fat and become lean again. So, I mean, the first implication of COVID-19 on the banking sector that I could think of is around the resilience and robustness of their operating models. It's really important for banks to, continue serving their customers. And with the global lockdowns and the social distancing restrictions in place, a bank can only do this if they've got the right and flexible operating model in place. They need to have access to multiple channels. And at the same time, it's equally important that these channels are super secure so that the customers feel comfortable and confident, dealing with their banks. The second implication that I can think of is around the people agenda and the new ways of working. And I think we are seeing a lot of focus from banks around the learning and development budgets and curriculum, not just for the employees, but for the senior management as well. They are trying to, help them build a new set of competencies and skills around how to deal with a disruption of this size and scale, how to, execute digital strategies within their departments as well as across the bank, and, topics like that. The other topic that we are, again, seeing some interest is, around manpower planning. The firms, in the banking sector are very keen to know what's the right size for them that can help them weather this crisis. Another implication of, COVID-19 in the banking sector has been around the operational sort of efficiency. And the two key themes that come to my mind are around, the cost reduction initiatives that the banks are undertaking and process optimization. It's really good to see when I talk to, banks in Qatar as well as across the world, that I get to see that banks are looking at the end-to-end life cycles of various banking transactions, and they're sort of identifying components that can either be simplified or, even made redundant or just, automated using different technologies, and that's helping them bring the costs down. And last but not the least, I think it's fair to say that the biggest byproduct of COVID-19 has been this massive push or drive towards digitalization. And they're just changing the way, we work and the banks operate in this world. Over to you, Umar.
Great. Thank you for that, Saeed. You touched upon the point around the people. Do you think we'll end up at a situation where we'll have a 100% work from home scenario for banks in Qatar?
I mean, I would love for that to happen personally, but having said, I don't think that, it's something that's feasible in the near term. The way I see it, I think in the short term, it's probably going to be, 50-50, half of the employee population working from home, half from offices. And then as situation develops, I'm sure, response will be developed as well.
Good. Thank you for that, Saeed. Just turning to Venkat, if I may. Venkat, we ran a poll a few weeks ago, and another question we asked bankers and industry leaders was really around some of their immediate challenges as a result of COVID-19. And in that poll, liquidity was the clear winner as being the immediate challenge back in March, April. What I really wanted to hear from you is really seeing what do you feel the banks are doing to help mitigate some of these risks around liquidity, both at the moment and also going forward.
Sure. Thanks, Umar, and good morning, everybody. I think that's interesting and obvious question, given that COVID virtually, unlike the 2008 crisis, COVID virtually brought all sectors to a standstill. And for banks especially, and for businesses, liquidity is prime to kind of keep the engine going. So as you would expect, I think in the short term, like it's happened in every other market, in the short term, the best way, or probably the only practical way, is for regulators to step in with some institutional support, not only to the financial system, but also as it happened in Qatar to the businesses through working capital facilities, if you like, to ease up short-term liquidity. Now, I think given that we are probably 3-4 months into the COVID situation, I think we are past that short-term crisis, if I can call it, and now it's up to the institutions, both banks, financial services in the wider space, and businesses to look at their own strategies, as Syed was mentioning, in terms of what has changed for them as a business, how they are going to be able to access customers, and what their operating model should be to be able to deliver that value to customers. Now, once they kind of start having a look at that and trying to reshape their strategy, operating model, and the way they will do business, and in some cases probably the products as well, products and services as well, I think that readjustment will need to happen for them to be able to assess their liquidity requirements in the medium term, say in the next 12 months or so, and then go on to tap into the liquidity buckets that might be available depending on who they are and their size and complexity and stuff like that, to be able to reset their liquidity bucket, if you like, and access them going forward. So I think it's now up to the institutions, and from talking to clients, both banks and non-banks, I think they are in the process of doing that, and there are no easy answers. As I said, depending on the size and complexity, the options will vary. Over to you, Omar.
Well, thank you. 2 quick follow-ups, if I may, Venkat.
Sure.
Obviously, at the state level, there's a $10 billion raising a few months ago. Have you seen some of that trickle down into the banking sector?
Yeah. The short answer is yes. I think there are, as you would imagine, there are 2 objectives to that, right? One is obviously to bring in liquidity into the economy, but 2 is also for us, the sovereign, to kind of whet the appetite in the international market for sovereign debt, which will then help corporates, banks, and others access the international market for liquidity. So I think those are the twin objectives, as I said, as is obvious, and I would expect some of these banks now to follow on from that to reactivate their liquidity program going forward.
Sure. Okay. And the second part, my question, you mentioned the sectors and how banks will obviously now reassess in terms of plans going forward and focus areas. Which sectors have you seen affected most as a result of the current pandemic from a banking perspective?
Good question. To be honest, I think it would be easier to answer saying which ones have not been affected, because it's been a virtual washout for most sectors, given that demand has just fallen off the cliff because of the COVID. So there have been very few sectors which have not been affected in the short term. So like the obvious ones like the healthcare and related and stuff, and the essential services in terms of food and the basic necessities of living have been able to kind of survive, in some cases maybe in a scaled down version. But the challenge is, I think, for everybody or for all businesses to look ahead to see, as I think we have discussed, what is that they need to do to be able to pull out themselves from this crisis and look ahead and go forward. And it might lead to some consolidations, as you touched upon on the banking sector that was announced earlier in the week or late last week. So I expect some of the stronger ones, or some of the ones who are sitting on cash, to be able to look at this as an opportunity to consolidate, to be able to gain market share, and therefore optimize their cost structures, if you like.
Sure. Okay. Good. Thank you, Venkat. We will come back to the point around consolidation later on throughout this session. So thank you for that. If I could maybe just invite Barbara for the next question. Barbara, historically and typically, tax has not necessarily been the most pressing agenda item, certainly in the GCC region. We've seen over the last few years tax rise in prominence in terms of a number of initiatives by regulators and governments across the region on the tax front. So I guess from your perspective, what I'd like to know first is the million-dollar question: is VAT coming or not? And I guess the second question is really, what should banks be doing to make sure they're geared up, not only for VAT, but also for the introduction of new tax regulations over the next couple of months? Barbara.
Thank you, Omar. So if you would have asked me this question, let's say, prior to COVID, my answer would be very much different. But now I would say VAT will still come, and this we clearly see that, in communications around the REBA, the new tax system, the tax authorities are mentioning VAT. So, for example, they were just mentioning they expect around 60,000 registration in the REBA now, and about 200,000 to come once VAT is introduced. Whether this figure is right or wrong, I'm not so sure. It seems to be a little bit high to me, but I think the message is VAT will come. However, I think due to the COVID situation, I understand that VAT will be delayed. So from my best guess, because officially there is still no communication, it will be probably mid-2021, which is the first realistic go-live date for VAT. To your second part of the question, what companies can do at the moment, or banks can do, certainly have a look at their systems. I would say that's the most important thing, because this is something which cannot be fixed very easily, to see whether all relevant data can be pulled out from the system, and the system is ready to cope with a complicated tax as VAT, and I think I will come to that later, also other taxes. And second, they should have a clear idea what VAT means for their pricing. Because, speaking about banks, they're in a regulated area. They cannot just increase their prices as they want. So they need to have a clear idea, and they need to probably start discussions with central banks whether and how they could increase the pricing. And I feel with the information which is available at the moment, that's possible to do now.
Sure, thank you for that, Barbara. So really, what's the driver here? Is it the revenue side? Is this a money spinner? Tax will become important, particularly VAT. Is it data? What's the real driver with all these changes that we're seeing in the tax front in the region?
I think the answer probably depends a lot on the jurisdiction. You have just heard about Saudi, who have increased the VAT from 5% to 15%. There, I would say money is the clear driver. They want to generate more tax revenue. I personally believe that when it comes to Qatar, probably the answer is a little bit different. I think it's more about collecting data, increasing compliance. Maybe not now really for banks. It's for all companies. And so I would say probably here in Qatar, it's more generating data and compliance. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Good. Thank you very much for that, Barbara. If I could now call upon Ali. Ali, governance and corporate governance, again, also for the last few years, I'd say, particularly with the new code issued in Qatar, has got an increased amount of focus and prominence as well. How has corporate governance been affected by the current COVID-19 situation?
Thank you, Omar, and good morning, everybody. Yes, well, governance, it's a subject that's, you're not going to reinvent the principles of it every time there's a crisis, but there will be practical challenges associated with what's happened in the last 3-4 months. I think most board meetings and AGMs that have happened in the last 3 months, we've seen the change in the way that they've been organized and using the technology as a way to facilitate these meetings. Something that you probably would not have thought about a year ago. And it's an indication of really how we really need to think differently at all levels. When you look at governance, it's really your relationship as a board with your shareholders, and as your relationship as a board with your management teams. And it's really about the personal touch. If you look at boards, typically the average age of a board is much higher than, say, the workforce that they oversee. And that in itself poses questions around the ability or the flexibility to change and and adopt new methods. But actually, the experience has been very positive on that. In fact, perhaps too positive that I would be very interested to see how the future goes with this area. The one thing I'd say that probably banks and every organization needs to think about is when they look at their board composition, is really to ask the question of who in our board is able to look at technology and question the technology decisions that we have to make. And I think considering how much reliance is going into that direction, I think that's a very valid question that a lot of boards need to ask and see how they're covering that area of their business.
Good. So do you, on that point, Ali, actually, do you think that we do need to raise and upskill when it comes to technology, knowledge and experience at a board level, even management level, actually, going forward?
Absolutely. Considering, when you go and say rewind the clock 12 months ago, when you chose an audit committee, which is composed of a number of board members, you typically pick the chartered accountant or you typically pick the lawyer or people who understand how to read financial statements or have been experienced in producing them. So why not do the same when the big chunk of your business is around technology? I think it's a very important area, considering I think the risk will increase in that area. And as an organization, as a main board role, is really to look at how risk is managed and are you safeguarding the assets for the shareholders, right? So to go back to the principal reason for existence, yeah.
Sure. Okay. Good. Thank you for that, Ali. Very useful. If you could maybe at this stage just go to the next poll question before we have another round of panel questions and really just kind of shifting gears, but on a similar theme, we're talking about technology, is how do banks view emerging fintech players? A, as a threat, B, as an opportunity, or C, neither? I think this is a very relevant and topical question at the moment, particularly as we've seen recently with the Qatar FinTech Hub that's been recently established. They're going through at the moment looking at potential entrance to the market. So this is an area where we could see increased number of players come to the Qatar economy over the coming years. And it'd be interesting to see how our attendees today view these fintech players. And I've seen mixed responses over the last couple of weeks on this very question as well. An opportunity. Again, the majority here, and very consistent with what we're hearing, is banks are really looking at this as an opportunity. It's good to see that our attendees today also have a consistent view, an opportunity to see how they can work with these new players as opposed to being somewhat afraid around increased competition. So on that note, if I could maybe just bring in Saeed at this point, really just to ask about this particular question. A, do you see this as a surprise in terms of the response? And B, how do you see actually the recent technology acceleration affecting the relationship between banks and these potential new entrants to the market?
Thank you, Umar. I must say, definitely no surprises. That was my answer as well. Now, in terms of, your question, it's really fascinating and interesting to see how the relationship has been developing and evolving between the banking sector and the fintechs and the startups, let's say over the last 8 to 10 years. The banking sector in itself has gone through a significant disruption lately, as we are all aware, in terms of, the products and services, the types of transactions, and most importantly, around the customer behaviors. The banking world back in the 80s, 90s, and I would say even the early 2000s looked completely different from what we see or what we have right now. My parents, I still remember, they used to prefer, and in fact, even today, they prefer face-to-face physical interactions when it comes to their banking transactions. The mix of products or the products on offer were quite simple and limited, and at the same time, the volume of transactions was nowhere compared to the current levels of what we see right now. Now with technology and digital coming into the picture, I think things started evolving. for the banking sector as well as for other industries. Definitely for good, but at the same time at an exponential pace. And with that, came along a completely new set of issues and challenges for banks to address. So naturally, banks started looking for solutions for these issues. For instance, they wanted to know how to handle this huge amount of data that they had started producing. They wanted to know, how to tackle the issues around increased cybersecurity threats. And they also wanted to see, what's the best way of handling or managing this ever-evolving set of, expectations from this new generation of customers, which is quite different, from the older generation. And I think fintech firms saw an opportunity and they came to their rescue, offering to help and, solve some of these issues. So this is how I see, the relationship developing between the two entities, the banking sector as well as the fintech firms. They're there to help each other. And it's really good to see that there is more and more collaboration being sort of being developed between these two sectors. And I also see a clear alignment now in terms of, their strategies and a way going forward. Because at the end of the day, all they want to do is make sure, the end users, people like us who bank, we have got a better quality banking experience that's more, cost effective and efficient at the same time. I think it's worth highlighting that I've been really impressed with, the way the regulators, the central bodies and the governmental bodies have stepped in as well, encouraging banks and the fintech firms to collaborate more. And by, either by easing or relaxing the rules and regulations in that space. And I think you've rightly pointed out, Omar, the recent launch of Qatar Fintech Hub by QDB has been a perfect example of that.
Yes, thank you for that, Said. And on that topic, Said, in the West, we see the likes of Revolut and the Monzos, and certainly in the UK, the Starling banks, these digital-only banks, whereby they are obviously competing with your traditional banks. In Qatar, do you see the emergence of a pure-play digital bank in the near future?
Short answer is no, not in the near future. It's probably going to be a mix of, conventional banks with their digital arms. But definitely in the long term, that's a viable possibility.
Sure. Okay. Good. Thank you very much. If I could just move on to Venkat, just shifting gears a bit and going back to some of the challenges that banks are facing. Apologies, Venkat, to keep putting you on the spot with the problems, but I think you're quite close to a lot of the action on the ground. So it'd be good to get your insights on how banks are actually looking at managing their real estate exposures. We've talked about this on numerous occasions and numerous forums. I think there's no hiding of the fact that banks and the GCC are quite highly exposed to the real estate sector, whether direct or indirect. And given the current market conditions, how do you think banks are managing that situation?
Well, I think it's a great question, but no easy answers. As you rightly said, Qatar is not in a unique position. The real estate overhang is pretty much there across the region. And as far as the region is concerned in Qatar as well, that was there even before the COVID situation kind of came upon all of us. The issues, I think, is, I would say, at a structural level, it's not really for the banks to find answers because banks are kind of living with the consequence of having put the money into the sector. One is obviously the overall demand needs to pick up across sectors or across the different asset classes in the real estate for cash to come in. So that clearly something is a more structural policy thing, initiatives that need to come into place. Two is obviously there needs to be a lot more avenues for liquidity that needs to come into the sector, because historically and traditionally it's been mainly banks that have put money or lent money into the sector. There have been discussions around REITs and other investment structures for which there are regulations and stuff that are in various levels of maturity across the region. Clearly those need to be activated, and that's also not an easy one to do, because at the end of the day, the cash flows that each of these assets need to generate from the demand that needs to come in is the engine to get this going. So in the short term, honestly, I would say it's not something that's easy to get out of for everybody that's put money into the real estate, and it might vary between the different asset classes in the real estate sector. the issue, obviously, from a bank's perspective, has also been around valuations of the sector, and is having looked at a number of valuations myself. Clearly, there's some work to do there going forward. I think the stakeholders need to take this as an opportunity to kind of reset the policies and the way to do valuations and the way valuations are looked at. I think that, in my view, will give, in the medium term at least, will give a more stronger footing for banks in terms of what they carry as collaterals on their books. But in the short term, I think there are no easy answers to that.
Sure. Okay. So just on that point around regulation around VALs, I did see an announcement earlier this week, actually. One of the other countries in the region announced a body that's been established to actually regulate and monitor how these valuations are actually carried out. So do you see the real case and opportunity here actually for the power that be within Qatar to look at somehow regulating the valuation market?
Yeah, true. I think there definitely is a case for that to happen. I think as valuation practitioners, I think all of us will appreciate that valuation, as they say, is both an art and a science, but is also driven by the level of secondary market activity that happens. And the depth of that market really gives you a robust valuation outcomes. Now, we can have all the theories behind valuations, but the practical side of it is that need to be real transactions that underpin the value of any asset in the market. So deepening the liquidity in this segment will give a more robust valuation outcomes. While I do agree that there definitely needs to be a far more more policies around who values, what you value, and how you value stuff. But I would also touch upon something I would say more fundamental especially for banks, is what do they really lend on? I think historically, if I may say, without taking away anything from the bankers on this call, I think there have been far more emphasis on looking at the collateral value from a lending perspective instead of, as you would traditionally expect, instead of looking at the cash flows. I think ultimately all of us realize that cash is what is going to bring cash is king, as they say. Cash is what is going to get the money back into the banks. So banks will have to therefore go back and look at feasibility studies far more carefully, stress test them far more carefully and far more realistically, to be able to make sure that it is not so much of a coincidence that the DSCR and the collateral values are all add up to the minimum numbers that satisfy lending requirements. So I would encourage banks to actually go back, Credit 101, and look at cash flows more than collaterals. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
That's fine. Thank you very much for that. Very useful. So just going back to Barbara, back to tax. Barbara, in recent years, CRS, FATCA, BEPS, we've seen a whole wave of tax-related, not all directly, but tax-related initiatives. What I want to just understand from you, Barbara, is around transfer pricing. Transfer pricing has been discussed a lot lately. So I just wanted to get your views around the introduction of transfer pricing, number one, and also number two, the tax regulations that were issued at the end of December for all entities obviously included provisions that do affect and impact banks. So just your thoughts around how the new tax regulation issued at the end of 2019 will also affect banks.
Okay, perfect. So maybe let me start with transfer pricing. So transfer pricing, it's interesting because transfer pricing was actually already embedded in the law for quite some time. So it's nothing which is new to Qatar. The only thing which is new is that there will be a reporting requirement on transfer pricing, and of course you need to establish reports, and so that's new. And we still wait for for a clear view or a clear meaning of the tax authorities what is actually required. And we clearly understand that the first filing of those reports will be due in 2021 for the year 2020. And of course, this gives us a problem because, transfer pricing is all about comparable prices. And it will be very, very difficult to find comparables for the year 2020 because it's nothing probably comparable. So the question is, can we go back to 2008? But also there, probably it's not really comparable what we have seen at the beginning of our discussion to the situation which we are now. So that's on transfer pricing. When it comes to the impact of all other regulations to the banks, maybe we have the first impact. We have the limitation of the tax exemptions here in Qatar. This depends a lot on the ownership structures of the bank. So there will be one listed banks with subsidiaries. They will be quite heavily impacted. Others may be a little bit less. What will impact all the banks here in Qatar is the new rules around withholding tax. Because, first of all services acquired from outside of Qatar will now be subject to withholding tax. And especially in case of, let's say, syndication of loans or also brokerage fees, which are paid outside of Qatar, this could be have quite an impact. But putting this real, new tax obligations aside, I think much more important is the new reporting requirements. So as you have correctly mentioned, we had already CRS, we had FATCA, now it's contract reporting coming in, transfer pricing, reporting requirements. So, and of course, with the REBA, the new system, which will be implemented now by the tax authorities, or it's currently implemented, everything will be much more transparent. So when you report something for one tax, it will be visible for other taxes. And the tax authorities, of course, will make industry views. They say another bank has this profit, why this bank has less. And this will lead to questions. And I think, and this is probably in line with what Ali and also Syed said, I think technology will be extremely important because it's all about data. And the banks will give more data away and they need to own the data. And this is only possible with technology, that they really, first of all, know what they are giving away. And second, that they have an idea how the tax authorities will interpret whatever they give away, which will then, of course, lead to questions.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. So one could argue that actually data is king rather than cash being king, as Venkat said. So what I'm hearing really is data is the real driver and the way forward. And combined with technology, it really could have a transformational impact on our sector and our industry going forward.
Definitely, and of course, no government says no to more money. So that's also, of course, not unimportant, but I think data is here king, as you correctly say.
So, sorry to jump in, Omar. Sorry to jump in, Omar. As they say, data is a new cash.
No, absolutely. And someone said to me last week, actually, I was attending another webinar, and someone said actually going forward, and even as we stand today, what we will be being is information-centric as opposed to being location-centric. And everything is going to be based on where the information and data is. Essentially, it's everywhere. So where we're based and where we're working will also have an impact based on what you've just discussed. So thank you very much for that, Barbara. If I could just go back to Syed at this point, just to talk about something we touched upon earlier in this session, talking about the transition away from LIBOR. I mentioned that's something that's coming in 1 Jan 2022, so we don't really have very long for that. Just wanted to get your views on whether that still stands, given the current situation we're faced with globally, and if it does, what banks should be doing from now based on the impact this could have on the banking sector in Qatar.
Thanks, Umar. I think it's fairly to say that, LIBOR transition and other regulatory obligations, they've taken sort of a backseat, especially over the last 4 to 5 months. And as, Ali and Venkat rightly said, I think banks have got their plates full. They've got so much to, take care of and address just to weather this crisis. Having said that, to your point, and as per the latest updates that we've been receiving from around the world, I think the transition date of December 2021 is still very much on. And it's good to see, the regulators across the world, as well as in the GCC, are pushing that agenda forward. We saw Qatar Central Bank, reaching out to the banks earlier this year, asking them, about their readiness plans when it comes to LIBOR transition. So it's good to see that things are moving along. Now, one thing I wanted to highlight is, there are regions in the world that, like US and UK, who are pretty advanced in terms of their assessments, readiness, and preparations when it comes to LIBOR. So I think it would make sense for the GCC countries to sort of, follow their footsteps and make sure that they, most importantly, learn from their lessons so that the same mistakes are not repeated again. Now, coming to the second part of your question, in terms of what is it that the banks can do or should do to be better prepared when this thing happens in December 2021. So, I mean, there is no magic answer to that because, every bank is different. They've got different level of exposures and impacts to LIBOR. Having said that, I think off the top of my head, I can think of at least 3 things that the banks should really be looking at if they haven't already started looking at. The first thing is to make sure, Umar, that they've got a central team or a working group in place that sort of, has got representations from across the bank. And, because it's a change that's going to impact the bank across all its departments, so it sort of requires a centralized response as well. Traditionally, finance and treasury have always taken, a lead on these initiatives, but of course with reps or representations from legal, HR, finance operations, and you name it. Once you've got a central team in place, the next thing that I think banks should really be doing is perform some sort of exposure assessment, looking at their books, looking at their contracts, looking at, the set of services that they have, and making sure that they've got a good understanding of what sort of impact LIBOR is going to have on their business and lines of businesses. So once you've got these 2 things sorted out, the next and the third and the most important thing for banks to do is to, put together some sort of a transition roadmap, I like to call it, which captures everything that the banks need to think about and take an action on between now and December 2021. And that's so that they can push that agenda forward in a very structured way. So I think these are the 3 things banks should really be looking into if they haven't started looking at, just to be better prepared.
Sure. And we talk about LIBOR, we say banks, but just affecting banks, or does it affect other industries and other entities also?
Sure, good point. No, definitely it goes way beyond just the banking sector. So I think the short answer would be any firm that has got any sort of exposure to LIBOR in terms of the products and services that they have will be impacted, and they will have to take actions.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for that, Saeed. So just turning to Ali, if I may. Ali, you've authored, and your team have authored an article in our publication around ESG and sustainability. Really, where do you see banks in Qatar actually standing with regards to the ESG agenda, which is obviously very topical at the moment? And what do you really see as banks needing to do or doing to be the sustainable bank of the future?
Thank you, Omar. Before I answer this, I want to go back to the data point, if you don't mind. And actually, I want to stick my neck out and say, probably in our working lifetime, somebody will come up with a way of valuing data and in your balance sheet. I think I can definitely see this happening, and maybe I can stick Venkat's neck out now and see if he agrees with me or not. But I think that maybe we'll put this aside, and I'll answer your question on sustainability and ESG. So yes, I think the principle around ESG is that we have to think of it as not a bunch of tree huggers trying to make the world better. It's really a principle that creates value. And those organizations, banks or customers of banks who realize this first and able to leverage on this value are, I think, the long-term winners of this. Unfortunately, a lot of our measurement criteria today are linked to short-term profit, and decisions are made around sort of 12-month periods or quarterly periods, which are not in sync with longer-term sort of sustainability type questions that you have to deal with. So I think there is a mismatch for sure in that, and that's a global issue. It's not necessarily a Qatar issue, but I think we're part of that. So I think that the answer to it, ESG will find its way into smaller aspects of the big question. So, for example, when you look at the question of diversity that everybody talks about, it makes business sense. It's not about necessarily only about doing the right thing, but it just creates a business sense, gives you access to a segment of the workforce that you probably would not have thought about in the same way, or we would not have promoted or developed in the right way. So I think overall it creates good economic activity, and it has a lot of trickle-down effect into different parts of it. But the thing is, how do you measure it as an organization as a benefit to you in the short term? And I think that question needs to be solved before we are able really to see big leaps forward in this area.
So, and as you say, Ali, there's no doubt there's clear correlation, positive correlation, between entities that are adopting ESG and effective at adopting ESG and their long-term share price and actually value.
Yeah, I mean,
clear correlation.
Lots of studies that have shown, where you go in say a developing market, and you have where the expectation of the investment community is that transparency is low, for example. But if you see two companies of exactly the same size, one with good governance and good transparency and one without, you typically see this reflected in their share price in most cases. So there's been a lot of studies over a number of years, so it's not a new concept. It's just a question of how you turn this into short-term decision making, and I think that's where the priorities start to shift, because we are really focused on short-term measures rather than long-term measures. Yeah.
Sure. Expect to see more women on boards in banks in Qatar?
I do. However, I don't think women think there is enough percentage, and I agree with that. I think there's definitely a lot of people who are very capable who can do a great job on boards. Yeah, and give a balanced view as well, a different perspective.
I see Barbara smiling as well, so I'm sure she's a supporter of that. So you have her endorsement. So thank you for that, Ali. I'm very conscious of time. We do want to make sure that we cover the Q&A, and I am following some of the questions being raised, and I will pose those to our panelists. So if I could at this stage just go to our last poll question, probably the most topical one that we're facing at the moment. And the question is there a need for further consolidation in the banking sector in Qatar? And is this likely to happen? The answers and the options are yes and likely to happen, A. B, yes, but unlikely to happen. And C, no. And I think this question is two-part. One is actually just the need. More importantly, do you as attendees and bankers see this as likely to happen? So hopefully we'll get your thoughts on this topic that's been debated and discussed well before COVID. Many people have been discussing whether the need has arisen just because of COVID or whether it's always been there. So it'll be interesting to see what the general view is on this question. So 55% yes, unlikely to happen, but there are 32% of you who are saying yes, but unlikely to happen. And I would say on this point that I think that the need or the clear or common understanding around the need for consolidation has been there for a very long time. We saw last year with Barwa Bank and IBQ coming together. We've seen in previous years where there have been talks. I think there's a unanimous understanding that consolidation is needed, so which is what we're clearly seeing here, with 87% of the population of our attendees saying there is a need. But in terms of whether that's likely to happen or not, I think we do have a split here. So thank you very much for your responses. At this stage, what I'd like to do is just go off camera and just look at some of our questions that have been posed in the chat box and ask our panelists to answer some of those. So just going through the questions that have been asked here. One question here, maybe Venkat, if I could ask you that question, is with the current oil prices, will this have an effect on the growth forecast for banks in Qatar?
Sorry, Omar, can you repeat that? I lost the last part of it.
So the question was, with the current oil prices, will this have an impact on growth forecasts for banks in Qatar?
The short answer is yes, but I would not pin it down on the oil prices. Given the COVID and the stress that we have been speaking about in the last 45 minutes or so, I think the focus on banks will be around their immediate priorities, which is impact on their operating model, how do they digitize, sorting out the corporate governance stuff that Ali touched upon. So in the next 12 to 18 months, I think there will be other priorities and not necessarily growth, priorities that will allow them to extract better value from the assets they already have on the balance sheet and manage NPAs and stuff like that. So I don't think growth will be on the list of top 3 priorities for banks in the next 12 to 18 months. So yes, the short answer is yes, but as I said, I don't think that's because of the oil prices. Oil prices might just be one of the reasons.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for that, Venkat. Next question we've got here, maybe for Ali. Will we have more consolidation? Back to the question that we just asked in the poll.
Yeah, Ali is on mute.
Yeah. I agree with the result of the poll. Actually, I think definitely considering the area, the space for growth is limited. Then 2 options exist: either you consolidate or you really look for growth in other parts of the world. So yes, I think it's inevitable.
Okay, thank you. Next question we've got here in the chat box. Venkat, apologies, I'm going to have to come back to you for this one. Question is, what is the future outlook of the energy financing sector and the demand for financing in the MENA region?
Great question. See, at the end of the day, energy or oil and gas is a commodity, right? When oil was trading at $9-10 in the turn of the millennium, I think it was doom and gloom, and then it went to 150, and then it's back where it is today. So it is a cyclical industry. So and money will flow into the sector as this volatility comes back and forth. So I don't think it's doom and gloom. So energy sector will continue to need money to invest and grow. But what I see going forward, and touching upon the sustainability topic that Ali was talking about, is that mix. I think in the medium term will change. I think it will go more towards the more renewable energies in terms of solar or wind, depending on which geography you're talking about. So the mix definitely will change as renewables and as maybe the battery technology in the case of electric vehicles and electric mobility picks up and technology kind of evolves in some of these segments. I think money will flow into different sectors within different segments within energy, while I'm sure the fossil fuel will have its role to play in the foreseeable future. So the short answer is yes. I think financing will continue to be in demand, but I definitely see the mix changing, and I also see because of the change in mix, I also see a lot more private money coming into the segment than historically in the fossil fuel segment, where there was a lot of government capital invested in that. So that would be my response to it.
Sure, thank you for that, Venkat. Barbara, one for you. Do banks need to have a CTO, Chief Tax Officer?
I think probably not yet, but going forward, I would say at least a dedicated tax team. I think every bank will probably require it going forward, or more resources in the finance team if the finance team should cover taxes as well. So I think in the short term probably not, but mid and long term, yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. I think we've got time for 2 more questions. Saeed, maybe one for you. How is COVID-19 impacting the people agenda?
Thanks, Umar. I think we did touch upon this topic when I was, just talking about the strategic implications on the banking sector. Having said that, I think there is one particular topic that we didn't cover earlier, and I think it's important to highlight. Is that, banks have started looking at the compensation frameworks and the incentive planning, topics as well. And now more than ever is the time for banks to look for an incentive or a bonus plan that not only just considers, employees' performance, but also looks at the market performance element as well. And I think this is really the need of the hour as well. So again, I think the incentive planning is going to be high on the agenda.
Great, thank you for that, Saeed. And then the last question, maybe I can take this one. The question is, what are your views on NPLs, and do you expect to see a huge spike in NPLs and write-offs once the lag effect of the COVID impact is reflected in banks' financials over the next few months? A somewhat loaded question here, but I think I'll probably cover this one. I think certainly from my perspective, we have seen slight increases in NPLs already, and we've seen an increase in provisions. I will go back to my earlier statement that the true effect of COVID has not really been reflected in banks' financials. So if we're looking ahead, I wouldn't necessarily say a huge spike, but I do think there will be pressures on NPLs. There will be increases in provisions, particularly as we're operating under the new IFRS 9 regime, where we're really looking at forward-looking factors and expected credit losses. So I guess to answer the question, not necessarily a huge spike, but I do think there will be pressures on NPLs, and this will really come to fruition at the year end at the earliest. So we are bang on 12 o'clock. I am conscious of time, as I said, so we'll probably bring this to a close now. I'd like to thank my panelists for all their insights and comments that have been shared through this session. As I did note earlier, we have got our publication which has been launched, so a lot of these thoughts and ideas and concepts have been explored further in the report. So please do feel free to delve into the report in more detail. And all I'd probably leave by saying is I think we're going through a transformational journey within the banking sector, not just in Qatar, but in the region. I do honestly believe that those that are agile and nimble and are able to adapt to the current way of working and the current way of dealing with their customers will be the banks that will be successful in the future. And I honestly believe that banks will come out of this more resilient, more effective, more efficient, more innovative, and all of this will only result in a better service ultimately for the consumer and the customer. So incredibly exciting times. And I'd just like to end by saying thank you very much for everyone for joining us today, and look forward to continuing the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.